Our next speaker, speaking on growing in a drier world, Dr. Sean Griffin, Director of Science and Conservation, our beloved Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center. So welcome.
All right, I definitely talk with my hands, so I'm going to do my best to not throw this microphone. But thank you all so much for inviting me. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak with you all today, because I know that you all are among our most vocal and important advocates for growing and protecting our native plants and habitats across the state. So to tell you a little bit more about myself and my background, so I've been director of science and conservation at the Wildflower Center for about 3.5 years. And before then, I was a postdoc at the University of Texas at Austin, also doing work at the Wildflower Center, working with our long-term data, some of the data that I'll be showing today. And I'm actually not a botanist. I know it's shocking, so don't ask me too many plant questions, but my background is in entomology, and my PhD training and all of my training has either been in honeybees or in native bees. And so I kind of got into this world through restoration for our native bee communities. So I'm going to start. I think that probably a lot of you, if not most of you, know about the Wildflower Center already, hopefully have been there. But I just wanted to start by telling you a little bit more about the center, just to give you a little bit of context for our research. So the Wildflower Center has been around since 1982. It was established as the National Wildflower Research Center before it changed its name. And we are the State Botanic Garden of Texas. Our mission is to inspire the conservation of native plants. And the main way that we do that is through our gardens, which are entirely composed of native plants. So we're one of the few gardens in the country that is just highlighting native plants. And we also do a lot of education around native plants and rare plants. And we run a database, the Native Plants of North America database, that gives information about native plants across the country. But what you may not know is that we are also part of the University of Texas. So we're an official field station as part of the field station network. And the gardens are actually only a tiny piece of our property. So we have 284 acres total. But out of that, the gardens are only about 20 acres. And that means that most of the rest of the space is kind of our science playground area where we can run these really large, long-term experiments. And so I'll be talking a lot more about this today, but I think this doesn't have a pointer. But this area here in orange is 70 acres of research that I'll be talking about. Then we also have areas that outside researchers can use, conservation area, and then a fair amount of space that we use for teaching college students and bringing in K-12 students. And so we get 250,000 visitors per year from the public, but we also get dozens of researchers from around the country. And a big aspect of our research that has guided us really since the beginning of the Wildflower Center is understanding land management here in Texas. So understanding how we can change our land management to better encourage the development of habitats and encourage native plants. And in the hill country, one of our main techniques is the use of prescribed fire. So we have a really strong prescribed fire program where we do prescribed burns, we do a lot of education, and then a lot of our research revolves around that. We also have one of the largest conservation seed banks in the state. And we do monitoring of some of the rarest plants. So this plant on top is Hinckley's oak. the only oak on the endangered species list, and it's found in just 2 counties out in West Texas. And then this beautiful plant down on the bottom is big red sage, Salvia pensteminoides, which is beautiful and sold in a number of nurseries, but actually only has 7 populations in the wild, something just like 500 individuals. So we work a lot with those species and others. But increasingly, we've found that drought and climate change are impacting every aspect of our work. So it's becoming more difficult to maintain our gardens. We have to use more irrigation. There's extreme weather events that are knocking back our trees. We also are finding that fire is harder to use. A lot of the management techniques that we've historically used are not performing the same way they always have. And we also find that climate change, drought is, we expect that it's actually one of the main drivers of declines in many of the rare plant species that we're working with. So this has been kind of an evolution of our team towards shifting a lot of our work towards understanding drought and ways that we can work with the environment to build more resilient landscapes. All right, good. The video works. So I think we're all aware that temperatures are increasing worldwide. Over the past 100 years, we've actually seen an increase in about 1 degree Celsius on average across the world. And something that may be a bit counterintuitive for people is that we don't all experience that climate change or even those temperature increases in the same way. So it really depends on where in the world and what habitats you live in. So on the East Coast, the main way that people are experiencing the really destructive effects of climate change are through increased hurricanes, increasing sea level rise. I lived in North Carolina for a while, and a lot of the houses there on the ocean are actually just tumbling in. And we're also seeing increases in flooding. Then if you look at the West Coast, there's much more heat waves, drought, and these really destructive wildfires. Like think about the Palisades fire that happened in the past year. And then here more in the middle of the country, we're experiencing some of those things, but we're also experiencing unseasonable cold snaps, like we've seen here, increases in temperature and drought as well. So I wanted to kind of narrow in and talk specifically about Texas. And so one of the ways that we are experiencing shifts in climate here are through rising temperatures. So I haven't vetted these data, but these are graphs from KXAN. Some reporting showing that the number of risky heat days, which is heat over a certain level for humans, has increased by 53 days over the past 50 years. And incredibly, but maybe not surprisingly, summer average temperatures have increased by almost 5 degrees Fahrenheit. And this one, actually, when I first learned it, kind of boggles my mind, but a lot of the climate predictions actually do not predict that rainfall is going to decrease under climate change in Central Texas. In fact, most of the models show that precipitation is either going to stay the same or actually increase by about 10%. And this may seem really counterintuitive, given that we're also experiencing more droughts. But these rain events are mostly going to happen as extreme flooding events, or these increases are through flooding events and extreme precipitation. So we're talking about more rain in shorter amounts of time with maybe more space in between them. And through evaporation and because of the space between these big events, we'll see more flooding and more drought, even if there is as much or even more precipitation. And I think that this is really on all of our minds right now after all of the tragic flooding that happened this year in our region. as well as this microburst over Austin that I read some reports that it was some of the densest, fastest rainfall ever recorded on the continental United States. And this is something that we've all experienced in the last few years as well. More ice events, more cold weather. And this also can be surprising to people, but as you see increasing temperatures and shifts in climate, you can see the collapse of a lot of the systems that keep our weather less variable. So all of those different weather events, they cause tragedy. They can be super expensive for the state. But possibly the most important out of all of these and the most destructive, even though it's not as flashy, is drought. So drought we can define as an extended period without rain that causes a reduction in availability of water in a system. And droughts are obviously not new. You can think about the Dust Bowl. There have been other major famines in the US over, the past couple hundred years. But what's really concerning is that in just the last few years, we've seen an increase in in how extreme and how frequent these drought events are. So in 2024 alone, there was about 148 million people affected by drought across the world, which led directly to 11,000 deaths, likely more. So in central Texas, this is some data that I pulled up actually just from weather stations right outside the Wildflower Center. And if you look at drought over the past 50 years, you can see that there's been a significant increase in these drought events. So don't worry too much about this graph, but it's showing the standardized precipitation evapotranspiration index, which is a pretty robust drought index. And it's different from just looking at precipitation because again, precipitation, if you just look at that, it's not capturing the whole picture. So this incorporates temperature and evaporation. And on this graph, 0 represents average conditions, while anything under 0 is wetter than average, and anything above 0 is drier than average. And so you could see that there has been a big uptick in the last few years. And it's a little hard to tell from here, but especially in the past 10 or 15 years, we've seen a big increase in these extreme drought events. So this is, if you go on Drought Monitor, I pulled this up in January, but this is very often what you see for Texas these days. You see patches of drought that kind of move around, and there seems to always be some drought in the state at this point. And then if you look back a little bit further, well, our last major drought was actually in 23 and 24. But if you look back further, many of you likely remember the drought of 2011. You can look at that map and it is just covered in red. That was exceptional drought. And I was reading some pretty shocking figures. They estimate that about 6% of all trees in the state died during that event. And it also caused nearly $8 billion in damages. Okay, so I've been talking a little bit about how drought affects people through water resources and food resources, but how does it affect our natural ecosystems? Well, of course, it can lead to a loss of biodiversity, so die-offs of different organisms, different plants and wildlife. It can also lead to more frequent and intense disturbances like wildfire. So think about last year, I think it was the Smokehouse Creek fire that burned about 1 million acres in the Panhandle, and I believe was the largest wildfire ever recorded in Texas history. And we can expect more of that. And then I know that we don't have snow like this and leaves changing color quite in this way. I took this from one of my wife's presentations because she works in the mountains. Um, but we can also see shifts in phenology, which is the timing of life events. So, for example, when bees or other animals emerge in the spring and when flowers start blooming, and if there's shifts in phenology, it can lead to plants emerging and growing at different times than their mutualists or their herbivores and lead to disruptions in the whole system. All right, so that was all a downer. I know it is, but I'm a restoration ecologist, which is an optimistic science. So our work is focused on trying to understand what's happening in these systems and then developing ways that we can start working to actually help these systems in the face of these big disturbances. So we know that drought is already happening here in Central Texas, and that means that we can study our plant communities and do experimentation to actually understand what's happening now, what we expect in the future, and how we can help correct the problem. So in all of our research with drought and climate change, we have two overarching questions. So the first is, how are droughts affecting our native plant communities now? And how can we use that knowledge to understand what's going to happen in the future? And then secondly, what can we do to protect our native Texas landscapes? So today I'm going to be telling you about three projects that we have running at the Wildflower Center. Just to give you a snapshot, there's still a lot of work to be done, so don't expect me to have all the answers. But I want to start by telling you about our long-term land management study. So this is an incredible study that's been going on at the Wildflower Center for 25 years. So first I wanted to define land management. I'm just going to be scratching the surface of land management today, but if you guys are interested in this, come find me or our team later. But land management are any actions that are used to manage our natural resources and improve ecosystem functioning. So these are really diverse. It can include altering grazing, seeding with native plants, mowing, and then, as I mentioned earlier in the talk, in Central Texas, it often involves the use of prescribed fire because this was a super fire-dependent landscape where in many regions across Texas, the land would have burned every 3 to 5 years. So fire, in many cases, is the best tool we have to restore land to its natural balance. So in 2000, the visionary researcher at the Wildflower Center, the late Dr. Mark Simmons, established this study to test the effects of land management over long time periods, to really understand not just the short-term outcomes of doing burns, but also the long-term outcomes. And this is a massive study. It takes up 70 acres of the Wildflower Center. It has 54 plots across 9 different treatments. And those treatments include burns that are conducted at 3 times a year, also mowing that are parallel to the burns. We have restore treatments. We have controls. So this is a very robust study. And then we do management every 3 to 5 years. But again, I'm not going to get too into the specifics of this. I know that the map is kind of complicated. But just to give you an idea of what this looks like, so this is actually a treatment year right now, which has been pretty fun. And this is a picture from one of our most recent winter burns. So we did this around February. And so we're doing prescribed fire. And then here's Dr. Christine Samerda, who's a professor at UT, studying emissions from the fire and also thermal characteristics of the prescribed burn. And this is from a few years ago. This is one of our summer burn plots. You can see that really nice line of the prescribed burn and really nice fire coverage. So the amazing thing about this study is not only have we continued it for 25 years, but we collect a lot of data from this study. So twice a year over that entire period, we go out with teams of trained staff as well as volunteers, many of whom are in the Native Plant Society, of course. And we work along standardized transects to understand the coverage of different plant species and how they're changing. So we go in and we identify carefully every single plant species, and then we record how they're growing, basically, in response to our treatments. Here are 4 of the people who have been most influential to the study. So Dr. Hans Landell, who was involved in the study and ran invasive species programs at the center for years. Dick Davis, who my guess is a bunch of you know, who's a land steward or was a land steward at the Wildflower Center. Michelle Bertelson, who's still serves as our ecologist and also runs a restoration consulting firm. And then Matt O'Toole, who is our director of lands and operations, but also our burn boss at the center. So he actually does all of the management for us, works really closely with our science team to get these studies off the ground. And you might be wondering why I'm showing this picture. Well, they're standing in front of binders. All of those are binders through 2021. And so, of course, we've added about 8 binders since then. It fills up an entire shelf or an entire bookshelf in my office. So just massive amounts of data. In some, we've observed about 300 plant species and made about 350,000 observations. So when I do my analysis, if they're larger models that I'm running, it can take up to a week for the model to run because there's so much data. And this study has been really interesting for me as an ecologist because I'm used to things being very murky and complicated. And it is very complicated, but it's one of those studies that you can just walk out there. Anyone can walk on our research trails and see the difference between these plots. So you can see this line right in between. And if you start looking at species composition, it's even clearer. So we see really big differences in what plants are found in different treatments, but also the abundances of those species in the treatments. Okay, so I've talked about management a bit, but this is a talk about drought. I could give a whole talk, maybe several talks on the land management angle, but we're talking drought today. So why am I talking about this study? Well, after 25 years and this much data collection, we actually can start picking apart the land management findings from how the plants and the environments are being affected by drought and other environmental factors. So in this part of our research, we ask the big question, how do plant functional groups, so how do different types of plants differ in their response to drought? And can we use this to predict community change in our grasslands? So for this study, we only looked at the grassland plants, and I'm focusing just on 3 of our treatments, combining the data just to make this a little bit more manageable. But we divided our plants into these 6 main groups. So we're looking at our flowering plants, the forbs, cool season grasses, which are C3 grasses, which predominantly grow and bloom in the winter and spring. And then our warm season grasses, the C4 grasses, which bloom and grow in the summer and fall. And then further, we're breaking that down by native and non-native, because often the non-native species or the invasive species that are able to establish are the ones that are really able to take advantage of disturbances and also are often very dominant species. Okay, so using this massive data set, we can then look to see how these plant groups have changed over time in response to drought. So here I'm showing our old friend, the SPEI drought index. Anything under 0 are wetter conditions here. Anything above 0 are drier conditions. And you can see that over the past 20 years, there have been many more years that are above 0, that are drier, than years that are wetter. And if you continued that to 2025, there's a number of spikes of drought. So what we can do is then plot our plant species or our plant groups on top of that. Okay, so this looks complicated, and I realized yesterday that my legend doesn't show the dotted lines, but dotted lines are showing invasive species or non-native species on this graph. And don't worry too much about the specifics, but the y-axis shows the cover. So you can think of that as the abundance of the different plant groups over time. And really what I want you to take away from this is that plant groups are responding differently. The warm season non-native grasses, which is that red line, actually shows a peak, and it's clear in our models, but shows a peak in response to these drought events, while our native species, especially the cool season grasses, show a strong decrease. And I'm going to pull that out in a much easier to digest way here. So again, we have cover on the y-axis, but here, let me grab the pointer. So here we have inverse SPEI again. 0 is average, drier conditions and wetter conditions. And you can see a really clear and interesting trend here. So this red line here is our most common non-native grass species, King Ranch bluestem. And you can see that it has reduced abundance in wetter conditions and increased abundance when it's drier. But you see an opposite trend when you look at winter grass, that native cool season grass. So I've just kind of cherry picked a few species here, but this is pretty consistent across the different plant groups. And then one thing that I find really interesting on here is this silver bluestem is a native species. It's also warm season grass, but it's native. And so it shows the same trend as this King Ranch bluestem, but it can't keep up. It doesn't show, it's not able to take advantage of the warmer conditions quite as much as the non-native species. Yes, and so the King Ranch bluestem is the non-native C4 grass. And so what's the big deal? Why do we care about this non-native species increasing? Well, any of you that have experience in our rangelands or have a pasture may know that King Ranch bluestem is a very dominant species. It can just take over, and this is a pretty typical picture for a lot of parts of the hill country with King Ranch bluestem. Can create these really dense mats, creates a lot of litter, and that leads to suppression of other species, reduced germination rates, and just fewer species in general. So I have a graph here showing as the proportion of non-native grasses increases, you see the number of species that you can find in that habitat decrease due to this behavior. So like I was saying earlier in the talk, it's been really interesting in the past couple of years because we've been going through another one of these really major drought events. And so and I've seen some really interesting behavior of the plants that make me think that even though we have this bigger story about how plants are responding, the most extreme droughts can have really variable effects, species-specific effects that we need to pick apart more carefully to understand what's happening in these communities. So this example is more anecdotal, but I wanted to just talk quickly about how these most exceptional droughts, these droughts that go on for, over a year with very little rain, can disrupt communities. So going back to 2011, there was exceptional drought across the state. And we found some really interesting trends when you start looking at individual species and how they responded. So again, these are cherry picked, but I just wanted to illustrate this point. So this, like the other graphs, are showing the abundance of these species over time. So over the past 20 years of the study, and the y-axis is percent cover, so how abundant the plant is. And really interesting thing is that while some plants, like our antelope horn milkweed, don't show any strong response to these drought events, other plants either show a really strong decrease or even an increase, or sorry, decrease or an increase over time. And that these big changes often last for many years. So, so the black-eyed Susan is a really interesting case, and we saw this in another number of other more dominant flowering forb species like Indian blanket. But you can see that after the drought that happened in 2011, we saw this big spike in black-eyed Susan, and then it maintained that higher abundance over time. What we think's happening there is, and again, we saw this with a number of flowering species. What we think is happening is that the drought hit the grasses hard enough that it cleared, basically opened up a lot of bare ground. Some of these forb species were able to establish, especially the ones that sit in the seed bank and respond really quickly. So once the habitat got more rain, they were able to bolt, and then they held that higher dominance over time because they were then able to reseed and establish. And we see this in a number of species. And so, looking through the data, it's hard to look at these most extreme drought events because they're relatively rare. We have 25 years of data, but we really have 2 points that we can look at for this. And so this past year, I've spent a lot of time walking around and thinking about this. And I've been amazed at how much flowering we saw last year once the drought started letting up, and how many species I saw coming up that we don't usually see across the grasslands with that same dynamic, massive die-off of grasses. And we think that that dynamic also may affect how other disturbances perform. So this is a picture hot off the presses, I guess. I took this about 3 weeks ago, and I usually expect our summer burns to be pretty hot and intense and fast. And our summer burn this last season was pretty bad. We had to walk in there and spread fire all over. We had to go back over some sites, and we still got really patchy fire. You could see all of that vegetation that didn't burn. And we think that what's happening is that, and this is specifically in the summer burn plots. And what we think is happening is that the drought is killing off, again, a lot of the grasses, reducing a lot of that biomass. And so it actually leads to less complete burns. And I don't have time to, again, go into the big differences between the plots, but we saw a different response in the winter burn plots that have more of the King Ranch blue stem, because they were able to maintain high biomass. And so those areas which usually have a calmer burn had a really intense burn this winter. So we're seeing these interacting effects of drought, fire, and species cover in these grasslands. Okay, so I'm going to give a summary for this first study, and I also should do a time check. Let me take a look. I'm good, but how good? Okay. Yeah, so in summary, plant responses to drought vary strongly by functional group. We find that invasive warm season grasses show a strong advantage under drought conditions, and that the most extreme droughts can have profound, long-lasting effects on plant communities in somewhat unpredictable ways. At least that's how I feel at this point. And we also find that extreme droughts may interact with other disturbances like fire in ways that are ecologically disruptive. Okay, so I want to switch gears a little bit, and we've been talking about effects at an entire landscape level, and I want to really drill down and look at very specific plant individuals to understand how plants are responding to drought and also affecting their habitats around them at an individual level. So I'm going to be talking about the soil moisture study that we've been doing over the past couple years. So here's an example of one of our grasslands. I'll explain all the flags. They're part of the study. This is our flag field. But this is pretty typical. When you walk into a healthier grassland, you'll see lots of different species, lots of different forms of grasses, some bunch grasses, some lower ones, and then often with space in between that lets forbs come up like we were just talking about. And plants, soils, and water in these systems are linked by really complex feedback loops. And so this graph is super complicated, and I'm not going to get into it because it being complicated is the point. So plants interact with water. You know, they're receiving water from the ground. They're also contributing to evapotranspiration. They're taking up nutrients. They're also fixing nutrients. And so they can affect, not only are plants affected by their environment, they can also affect the environment that they're growing in. And this is often driven by all sorts of aspects of the plant itself. So I always love this. I'm sure most of you have seen this, but when we look at a grassland, we're only seeing a tiny piece of what's happening. Most of the activity and most of the biomass is underground. And so they have really different root structures. They can have different amounts of biomass above ground and below ground. They can also take up water in different ways. And this can contribute to where they're able to grow and also how they interact with those habitats. So this work was led by one of our star undergrad students, Summer Montoya, who also stayed after she graduated from UT. She continued to work with our group for a little less than a year on this project. She's now in grad school in Nova Scotia because it was probably too hot doing this work. But we looked at this, and her background is in geology. So I thought, perfect, let's look at soils. I don't know anything about geology. And so we asked the big questions: how does the species of grass influence the soil moisture and other soil properties? And then if the grass species is affecting those conditions, what characteristics of the grass species drive these differences? So we picked 4 focal species that are common in our area. These are probably old friends to most of you. So we have 3 native species. So wintergrass, which is a cool season grass. It's a really tough little grass and relatively low litter production, and survives in a lot of these areas that have heavy grazing because cattle don't like it as much as a lot of the other species. Then there's silver bluestem. Again, that's a warm season grass. It's a bunch grass that grows in dense clumps, creates a bit more biomass. Then there's side oats grama, which is another warm season grass, but it's relatively low growing and grows in these bigger stands of dense vegetation. And then finally, King Ranch bluestem, the bane of our existence, which is a non-native warm season grass that grows in dense patches and importantly creates a lot of litter. So what Summer did is we worked in a meadow at the Wildflower Center. She went out and mapped all of these species of grasses across this meadow, and she selected points where these grasses were dominant, and she then took all sorts of measurements within those clumps. So she collected just so much data. She took soil depth. She collected soil for soil compositional analysis. She took biomass, measured the communities of plants around them. The goal was to really understand what the growing habitats of these grasses were. And then at the end of the season, she collected the grasses and weighed their roots. She then, in this picture, went out every 2 or 3 days for about 3 months and recorded the soil moisture and soil temperature to understand how these different grass species were driving those characteristics of the soil. Okay, so I don't love these graphs because the color schemes are different, so that's why I kind of put them tiny. But the point here, what I want you to look at is that there's different sizes of bars for the different species. And what I really want to impart is that different plant species have different microhabitat requirements. So this top graph is showing that the grass species differed in their biomass. We also found that they differed in the amount of bare ground surrounding them. So winter grass had the highest amount of bare ground. They also differed in the depth of soil that they're associated with. And so our challenge was then to take all of this and combine it with the soil moisture and the soil temperature data to understand, to combine it so we could then pick apart these different drivers of environmental characteristics. Okay, so this is going to be a lot of little points, but there's no getting away from it. So just, again, let it wash over you. But so I have our 4 different species. The lines are going to be in different colors. And we're looking across this entire 3 months of the study to understand how the conditions under the plants, what was the soil moisture. So this is volumetric water content on the y-axis. And so points that are higher mean more water content in the soils, so potentially more resistance to these dry conditions. Points that are lower show less soil moisture. And we then looked at all of the periods in which the soils were drying over the course of these 3 months. Okay, so it was a long spread, and so there were multiple times when there were small rain events. And so we looked at the dry down for each one, and I'm definitely going to use the pointer for this. So we found, and this will be clear as I open up more of the graph, but we found kind of consistent differences between these different species. So you can already see in this first one that the different species have kind of a different trajectory when it comes to soil moisture. And this becomes even clearer when we used our modeling techniques to separate out the soil moisture or grass identity from all of the other characteristics of the microhabitat. But you can see that Texas wintergrass had the lowest volumetric water content underneath it for the whole run. And I don't know why I pulled that one out because that's really hard to see. But if we go ahead and look at the entire run of the experiment or of the study, you can see each of these gray bars was our focal dry down period. And you can see that it's relatively consistent that the side oats had the highest water moisture in the soils, while the winter grass had the lowest. You can see this in every one of the dry down. And we believe that that's driven by a number of different factors that we can't separate out at this point, but including the amount of biomass they're creating, as well as just their growing habit. So how much water they're uptaking. And so what this means in sum is that we would expect, okay, great. I'll move a little faster. We'd expect that that communities that have more of these species that trap more moisture may be more resistant and resilient to drought effects. So in summary, we found in this study that grasses differ in their preferred microhabitats and growing conditions. They also influence soil properties such as soil moisture through feedback loops. The effects are likely driven by a combination of grass characteristics, including litter production, biomass, and growth behavior. And the big take-home point is that through feedback loops, species composition may affect resistance. So how a community is able to resist the effects of drought, as well as resilience, so how they're able to recover from drought. And yeah, it affects their response to drought and other shifts. So I have one more project, but only 5 minutes. But the good news is that we do not have any results for this one. So I'm just going to tell you that up front so you don't, I don't know, have your hearts broken. So this is our grassland response after multiple alterations, GRAMA study. And yes, we came up with that acronym just because we like the grass. And so this study is part of an ecological network. So ecological networks are these there's a number of them now, these networks that collect data in standardized ways across the world, and then bring that data together to make these really big studies and large conclusions about how environmental changes and disturbances are affecting communities in a broad sense. And so there's a number of these ecological networks. The first and most successful to this point was the nutrient network that had about 300 partners. But we joined 2 of these networks, DragNet, which is disturbance focused, so disturbance and recovery across global grasslands, and then DroughtNet, which looked at the effects of drought. And so we decided to do this at the Wildflower Center because we wanted to join these networks. But also, we thought that we could make a novel contribution by making this study larger and looking at the interacting effects of disturbance. So this study was led by our lab as well as Dr. Amy Wolf, who's a professor in integrative biology at UT. And my lab will tell you that it's a problem when me and Amy get in the same room because we always scale things up and make the experiment bigger and bigger. And so I'll talk about the questions first. So the 2 main questions of the study were, how do ecological disturbance affect plant community composition function, and how do disturbances interact with an eye towards understanding if the effects are compounding? So like I said, we always do too much. And so we decided not just to do the one type of disturbance for each of these networks, we decided to combine the 2 networks and do 4 types of disturbance, including tilling, so land clearing, drought, where we created these structures that prevented 66% of rainfall, nutrient addition, which is part of the protocol for these 2 other networks, and then also prescribed burning, which is kind of a Wildflower Center special because our systems are so dependent on burning. And we then created many more replicates and did crosses of all the disturbances. So we ended up with 14 different treatments across 84 plots. And because this is part of these ecological networks, it's an expected run of at least 10 years. So this is what the experiment looks like, one tiny piece of the experiment. So you can see that because it was all randomized, we have some plots with drought, some with drought and disturbance, some with drought and fire, etc. Then we go out and collect all sorts of data. So relying largely on the help of our genius undergrads, we go out and collect plant community composition data. We also look at soils, biomass, and then have a number of other studies looking at pollinators and flowering plant phenology. So here's some pictures of sorting biomass and taking light measurement readings. And then we've also partnered with a couple of different labs, one through the USDA, taking drone imagery of these sites to understand plant stress as well as biomass, as well as working with that lab in geosciences to understand emissions, emissions and intensity of the fires in this site. And again, no results, but I did want to just show you that the treatments are working, and we've done a little bit of analysis. There's really interesting combined effects of these different treatments. So we find that tilled plots, as you'd expect, are rapidly colonized by weedy species. And the drought plots are showing higher bare ground, less biomass, and fewer species overall. But we are very excited to jump into the specifics. Okay, so I'm going to race through my conclusions, but would be happy to talk about these with you all later. But overall, through these studies, we found that drought can have profound, long-lasting effects on grassland plant communities. Plant composition matters because species differ in their responses. So the response of a grassland to drought or other disturbances will largely depend on the composition of the plant community. We also find that plant composition can cause feedback loops that further influence their growing conditions, and that warm season grasses and non-native species may have an advantage in changing climate regimes. So I said that, I don't want to leave you all on a downer note. So an interesting thing about these studies is that they actually do point towards some solutions. The first is that because invasive species may increase under these increasing drought regimes, it is essential to control our invasive species through whatever land management methods we can. We find that burning and mowing should be done in the summer and fall to avoid encouraging invasive warm season grasses, and that healthier grasslands with more species will show increased resistance and resilience to drought in the future. I'm not going to get too far into these future directions, but I wanted to talk about all of the things that we're looking at in the future. So we're really focusing now on multi-species interactions between plants and their pollinators, herbivory, and also the linkage between above ground and below ground organisms. We also want to better understand the interacting effects of fire and climate because we're seeing some really interesting interactions there. And then we want to refine our management practices to build better resilience in the grasslands. So that's all I have. But I wanted to give a really quick plug for our Texas Plant Conservation Alliance. So this is a network of conservation organizations across the state, and organizations and individuals who are passionate about working with rare plants and saving rare plants. And so we are always looking to talk with folks who grow or work with rare plants, and those landowners who may be interested in working with conservationists to bring people out to their land to do conservation. So I have a long list of folks to thank, so I'm not going to go into specifics, but sorry if you're on here or not on here, or if I misspelled your name. But I want to thank the late Mark Simmons, who designed and established the long-term study at the center, which is really a cornerstone of our work. Our dozens of rockstar volunteers and our lab staff and students, and then all of our funders and donors that make this work possible. And I hope I have time for questions.
We've got a couple.
One question, I'm sorry, everyone.
We've got a couple of questions from our virtual registrants. The first one is, have any of your studies been published?
So we do have, well, quick answer is no for the drought work. We do have studies published for the management, but the drought angle is something somewhat new that we're working on, but you can look forward to that soon.
And the second one is, I should have said, from Susan Fortenberry. I have a question about grasses native to West Texas, now being used in the horticulture trade and marketing across the whole state as native to Texas when they are not native to other ecoregions. One grass in particular that I'm concerned about is Nacella tenuimina, sorry, Mexican feathergrass. Are you seeing this grass coming up in native areas, or does it seem to be staying where it is planted in urban, suburban landscapes?
Good question. Something that we need to look into more. I'm trying to think of any grasses that we're seeing invading from other parts of the state. I can't think of any examples of that, but I think it's a conversation that we should have possibly through our Plant Conservation Alliance. Do I have time for one more? Yeah. Yeah, so the question was, can we compare burning versus mowing? And again, that in of itself is a whole other talk. But the really quick answer is that mowing does to some extent replicate burning. It just doesn't have as much of an effect. So if you're looking at a summer burn versus summer mow, the mowing does reduce your King Ranch blue stem, but not as much as a burn. It does increase plant diversity, but not as much as a burn. So we do recommend that people, if they're not able to burn, mow on the same regime that you would a fire. So that 3 to 5 years, but depending on where you are in the state, and do it within the appropriate season, which in this region is usually either the summer or fall. That's it. Yeah, find me later. We have a booth for the Texas Plant Conservation Alliance, and I'd be happy to answer questions.